Right. Hello, everyone. I'll try not to mess it up this week. I think everything is working. So, hello. Welcome to Lecture 13 in the module that some people are already calling the politics of religion. And the purpose of this lecture is to look over issues relating to human rights, religious freedoms, and the law. And this is always a topical issue, and there have been a number of high-profile cases in this area in the past few years, some of which I'm going to look at today. So, for example, the French ban on displaying conspicuous religious symbols in public, which we've touched upon previously in classes on secularism, for example. This raises questions about the extent to which the state should be able to regulate religious clothing and regulate people's identities to that extent. And we've also got at the bottom the Asher's gay cake affair, which is when a bakery in Northern Ireland was taken to court for refusing to bake a cake containing a message with Bert and Ernie on it. We'll come back to this at the end of the lecture, celebrating same-sex partnerships, which raises the question as to whether or not private businesses should be able to refuse people service on religious grounds. And then finally, top right here, we've got the case of a guy called Joseph Kennedy, who was a football coach in the United States, who claimed to have the right to pray on the football field after games, which is another case I'm going to discuss, which raises obvious questions in the United States about the separation of church and state. So these are some of the things I'm going to be talking about today, and the plan for the lecture is spectacularly straightforward. First of all, I'm going to talk about religious freedoms in a global context. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some legal issues in the United States. And finally, I'm going to talk about some legal issues in Western Europe. Now, it should be noted at this point that the second part of the lecture does look rather Western-centric. That's not because the Western system of things is necessarily superior to anything else. It's to do with the fact that, or largely to do with the fact that the legal systems that have been established in Western liberal democratic nations to look at issues of religious freedom have overwhelmingly shaped the international discourse on religion and human rights. And it's also the place where you find the sharpest conflict between religious freedoms and human rights, precisely because you have set up defined legal regulated frameworks for addressing them. So that's the plan. The first point to make then, looking at the global context, is that I need to apologise for having lots of slides that have words on. There are a few texty slides in this lecture. The first sort of third is basically looks like this. But there's no way around it, because you'll see as we go, I have to give you statistics and I have to give you a couple of quotes on things. And this is, as you can see, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, Article 18, set up in 1948, which is essentially the way in which religious freedom is globally enshrined. This is one of the foundational documents that puts this on a legal footing. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it basically sets out that people have the rights to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, the right to change their religion or belief, which is an important category, by the way, which we'll come back to later on, ability to teach, practice, worship according to their faith or lack thereof, and this is why I've flagged this particular line up, to manifest his, should be obviously his, her religion or belief. That's quite an important signifier. And I am going to come back to that word manifest later on in the lecture, right? So just flag that up for now, right? And as I say, we'll come back to it as we go. So effectively then, this is the global commitment to religious freedom. And it seems pretty unequivocal, right? But the reality is rather different, and here are some statistics. These are the latest figures from Pew. The figures are from 2022, but these are the latest ones that they have, looking at restrictions on religious freedom around the world. And as you can see, 30% of all countries in this sample were classed as having high or very high levels of government restrictions on religious freedom. This is the highest number since Pew began tracking this back in 2007. The median number, this is on a scale of 1 to 10, is currently, if you look on the right-hand side, around 3, which is a significant increase on the baseline figure of 1.8 in 2007. So the situation is not great, and it's been progressively getting worse in terms of restrictions imposed on religious freedoms. Pew have also examined the extent to which blasphemy laws or policies are in place around the world. And these are essentially laws or policies that make it illegal to insult religion or to offend religious individuals or religious sensibilities in various ways. Now, this is not an easy thing to work out, because not all countries will have a law which says, this is the blasphemy law, right? And then they have the legal code. Often, rules against blasphemy will be kind of hidden away under other criteria, or they'll be kind of, shuffled away into other sort of policies or regulations. Things like, for example, defamation of religion, right? So if you just go to the legal codes and you start looking for blasphemy, you might not find it. But there will be things very often in there that will equate to blasphemy. So it's not always easy to work out exactly what's going on here, but according to Pew, a total of 79 countries in 2019, which was 40% of the world's total, had blasphemy laws or policies in place. And in some countries like Iran, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, the punishment for blasphemy could include death. The 2024 annual report by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, this is when, of course, the United States was still a serious country. And I say that kind of half in jest because, this is, the US Commission is one of these places where you go to get good data and, start to wonder, in 5 years' time, will you still get good data from the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, or will it become, the Trump Commission on such and such a thing and turn into a complete disaster? But anyway, as for now, these figures are still pretty good. And according to the US Commission, there were 96 countries with laws against blasphemy, 28 of which were on a special watch list, which was a list of countries of particular concern. So there are quite a few countries around the world that have blasphemy laws or policies in place, and there's quite a lot of restrictions on religion around the world. But you don't have to go far. And sometimes I think, because we live in sort of Western liberal democratic states, we sometimes think that these kinds of restrictions on religion and blasphemy laws and so on apply really in sort of other parts of the world, right? But it's not necessarily the case. Here are some examples. You don't have to go far to find them. From Western European states, and this is Article 404 of the Italian Penal Code, which, as you can see, makes it punishable with a fine of up to €5,000 if you publicly offend a religious confession. The list of countries that also has blasphemy laws or policies in place here includes Austria, as you can see, Switzerland, Germany, and Poland. And many other European countries have only recently abolished their blasphemy laws. There's a couple here, obviously New Zealand, not in Europe, and Canada, of course, who may be classified as Europe in the next few years. Who knows? But it's a fairly extensive list. But the thing here is that these countries have only abolished their blasphemy codes recently. Scotland being the most recent, of course, in 2021. Northern Ireland, by the way, still has blasphemy laws technically on its books. Now, one way to assess the scale of restrictions on religion, because it's not always clear what we mean by restrictions on religion, right? And I'm not going to ask you to do this, but if I was to ask you to write a list of things, you'd probably come up with a whole bunch of different ways in which religion can be restricted, right? It's not necessarily one or two things. It spills over into a whole bunch of different areas. This is one way you can look at it. This is from Grimm and Fink, who came up with this measure called the Government Regulation of Religion. And they tried using this, I mean, the paper obviously goes into this in a lot more detail. This is just the sort of headline figure as to how they reckoned restrictions were to be coded. And what they tried to do is to then quantify how extensive religious restrictions were. And this is obviously, pretty straightforward, but it can include things like, for example, an outright ban on religion, which is pretty obvious, right? If you ban someone's religion, that's quite a significant restriction on their religious freedom. You can also have bans on conversions. You can also have bans on building new places of worship, bans on or restrictions on importing religious literature into the country. You can restrict the ability of religious groups to teach their religion in schools, and so on and so forth. Right? There's a whole bunch of different ways in which you can restrict religions if you're so minded. Now, one interesting thing about this is that levels of religious restriction also varies according to the type of religion we're talking about. Now, we've done this in various different contexts, right? We talked about democracy, and there's obviously a democracy gap in the Muslim world, and there's a debate which says, well, maybe Protestantism is better for democracy and so on. And we saw similar things around capitalism, free markets, and so on, right? You can also do a similar thing with religious restrictions. And so here are some figures. These are my own calculations, so they could be wrong, but you are more than welcome to go and do them yourself. I used data taken from, and I've given you this website before. If you haven't looked at it yet, you definitely should. The Association of Religious Data Archives, the ARDA, the Association of Religious Data Archives, and they have a whole bunch of, it's actually quite overwhelming the amount of data they have there, but buried in their site somewhere is a list of countries, and they will have these countries measured by this particular scale. So I went through all the countries using this scale, and then I cross-referenced them with according to, whether or not that country was a majority Muslim country, majority Christian country, or, whatever it was. And this is what I found. The results are on a scale of 0 to 3. 3 is the most restrictive. The most restrictive religion in the world, according to the government regulation of religion, is Islam, which came out with a score of 2.6, which is quite high, from a total of 53 countries, which, again, fits, right, with most of the literature, the stuff we were talking about previously on democracy gaps in the Muslim world. The second, not too far behind, was Orthodox Christianity, which came out with a score of 2.4 from 15 countries. In third place, I'm doing this obviously one by one to kind of keep the tension going, right? You can appreciate that, trying to wring as much drama out of this as possible. In third place was Buddhism, with 1.9. 10 countries. 10 is a fairly small, 15, of course, is fairly small, but 10 is, it's kind of on the edge, really, as to whether or not that's meaningful. I completely ignored Hinduism, because just 2 Hindu-majority countries in the world, so, sample size is stupid. So they're not on the list. In fourth place, we have Catholic majority countries, which comes out at 1.5 from a sample of 58. And then in fourth place, with the fewest or least amount of government restrictions on religion, were Protestant majority countries with a score of 1.4 from 48 countries. Now, this is perhaps a little bit surprising. The Protestant thing, again, does sort of back up all that stuff we were talking about before, in terms of Protestantism being more closely perhaps linked to democracy. But, it's not really, is it? You're talking about 1.4 versus 1.5 for Catholicism. And, there is the part of the debate on religion and democracy, of course, is that Catholicism is a hierarchical, authoritarian religion and therefore might not be so, finely attuned to the ways of democratic life. And these kinds of scores don't really support that particular finding. And of course, Orthodox Christianity, kind of gets omitted from a lot of these debates, and yet here we see it sitting, quite high up the list. So government regulations on religion vary according to the type of religion, and they also vary according to the type of regime we're talking about. So again, these are figures of my own using the data from ARDA, but this time cross-referencing them again in case anybody gets any crazy ideas about doing the same kind of thing, you're more than welcome to. I got the list of democratic countries from the Economist Intelligence Unit Index, and then just cross-referenced them and added everything up and divided by whatever, right, to get the sort of mean average score. And as you can see, looking at this, authoritarian countries had a government restriction of religion of 2.4, and it drops down, as you would expect. Hybrid countries, it's 2.0. Flawed democracies, 1.6. For democracies, 1.4. So this is entirely unsurprising, but it does sort of back up what you might think in terms of how these particular regimes would work. The question then, maybe, which sort of comes out of this, is why? Why do governments even care about this stuff? Why would you want to, if you were a government, why would you want to regulate religion? What's in it for you? Well, there are various reasons why governments might want to do these things. And one obvious reason, which goes back to social control theory, which obviously we spoke about very early in the module, is that it can be a very useful way of keeping themselves in power. So in countries, for example, that have a dominant religion, protecting that religion can be a useful way of maintaining the legitimacy of the regime, or trying to keep religious elites or certain influential sections of the population on side, because they would perhaps have a vested interest in protecting their religion, keeping their religious position, their influence, their power, and so on. And so by doing that, by supporting them and by restricting other people's religions, you can therefore support your own particular position. So that's one reason. Another reason is that, which I guess is a sort of converse of this, state officials might want to scare people or put them off or deter them from protesting or opposing the regime. They may see certain groups in society as being potential sources of unrest, like the Uyghur, for example, would be a really good case in point in China, or Falun Gong would be another really good case in point. In China, starting out as being a sort of a very low-level, well, it wasn't described even as a cult at that point, just a low-level sort of organisation, mixing in things like Taoism and Buddhism and various other bits and pieces. And then it got too big, essentially, for the Communist Party of China to tolerate. And when it got over 1 million members, they started to think, hang on a minute, this is a potential, alternative power base to the state. And so they declared the government of China officially declared Falun Gong as being an evil cult, and it's now and has henceforth been illegal. So you can deter people from, opposing your regime by restricting religions in various different ways. Here are two particular examples of this. One is the case on the left of a chap called Raif Badawi, who was a blogger who was arrested in Saudi Arabia in 2012 for insulting Islam and was sentenced to 7 years in prison and 600 lashes, which was later on appeal increased to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes. After the first 50 lashes, which I guess is no fun, he was kept in prison until he was eventually released a few years ago. This was in 2022. And then we've also got the case on the right of Tataloo, who is an Iranian rapper who has spent 18 years, or has been sentenced to 18 years in jail for, again, insulting Muslim sensibilities. Nothing at all, I would imagine, to causing a few problems for the theocratic regime. So, religious freedoms are restricted in many parts of the world, and as we've seen, there are quite extensive restrictions actually on religious freedoms. And there are lots of countries that will go down the line of trying to impose these sorts of rules and regulations. On the opposite side of the coin are countries that have laws specifically designed to protect religious freedom. But here again, the situation it's very straightforward. And a classic example of this is the United States. So this is the First Amendment, which I'm sure, as all good politics students, you will have seen and encountered at some point during the last few years. This is, we saw this ourselves, spoke about it briefly in the class on secularism. The First Amendment states, as you can tell, Congress shall make no law establishing religion or to prevent the free exercise thereof. This is essentially broken down then into two clauses. Okay, you have the Establishment Clause, which says that the government cannot make a law establishing a religion. So the government, the United States federal government couldn't do we couldn't have a situation like we have in the UK, with the Church of England being the official state religion, right? The monarch is head of the church and all that kind of stuff, right? Officially supported. Couldn't have that in the United States because it would be a breach of the Establishment Clause. At the same time, we also have the Free Exercise Clause, which means that the government is limited or very, very limited in the ways in which it can restrict the exercise of people's religious beliefs. These two things don't always fit together very well. And this has led to a number of interesting legal issues. For instance, many of these disputes centre on displays of religious symbols in public grounds or property. So, for instance, we have cases of nativity scenes being displayed in public parks. There have been court cases around that because is that promoting a particular religion over others? It's okay to have all religions represented in that particular space, but if you have just one and you don't let the others come in, and there's public funds involved, or if it's a public space, then there are grounds for going to court on the Establishment Clause, because it looks then like the state is supporting and promoting one particular religion over others. So you have the nativity displays. There's been court cases around prayer banners in schools, graduation ceremonies, and they have big religious banners up, or banners at sports events, for example, celebrating religion, displaying the Ten Commandments outside courthouses. The reason why you can see here the 9/11 wreckage, I don't know if you know about this, the 9/11 museum, there was a cross-shaped piece of wreckage which found its way, it was put into the museum. Obviously, for people of the Christian faith, this was, or for many of them, this was seen as a symbolic representation of what had happened on that day. And the court case was that this particular item was being given undue prominence over items from other religions, and so there was a court case around the 9/11 museum. That one failed. And also we have periodic cases to try to get In God We Trust taken off the US currency, which have also gone nowhere. But these cases do keep coming up and up. And a high-profile example of this, the guy I mentioned at the top of the lecture, is Joseph Kennedy. So Joseph Kennedy was a football coach in the United States. He wasn't a very good football coach, I think it's fair to say. His team was not doing particularly well. They kept losing lots of matches. The reason why I think this is funny is because he was sitting there thinking, why does my team keep losing? I think there's sort of parallels here to Spurs, right? I can imagine the Spurs manager sort of doing a similar thing. Why is this happening to me? And he was sitting there one night, and by his own admission, this was his story, right? He's sitting there one night wondering about this, and there was a film, came on cable TV that he was watching. The film was about a football coach who started praying to God to get better results, and their team started to get better results, right? It's like, I don't know if it was on Netflix or something, but it was one of these sort of, B or C grade made-for-TV movies. And so he thought, that seems like a good idea. And I'm out of other options. Obviously, my tactical nous is going nowhere, and my ability to motivate the players is obviously limited. So I'm going to try praying to God for better results. So this is what he started doing. He started getting better results. So, who am I to sort of criticise him for this? But the problem was, he started to do it on the football field immediately after games. And so the legal position in the United States since 1962 had been that prayer in public schools or school functions was in breach of the Establishment Clause, right? You cannot do it because that is then effectively the school promoting or supporting one particular religion over others. And so this was a problem because, the football field belonged to the school and he was praying on the field during his role as a coach. So the school then objected to these activities and they offered him a private space to use instead. But he said no, he can't use a private space because A, he was entitled to pray on the pitch because of his religious freedom. And secondly, he claimed that the prayers were private, it was a private moment, nobody was being forced to join him. It was just him, on his own. The school then said, no, it's clearly not private because you're in the middle of a football stadium surrounded by thousands of people. And also there is the sort of slightly thorny point that, members of your team might feel a certain amount of coercion, social pressure to join in because they might think if I don't join in with these prayers, then I'm not going to get picked for the team, right? So there was a certain amount of, suasion going on. Anyway, as a compromise then, the school said, OK, you can do it on the pitch, but you have to wait till everybody's gone home, right? Then you can have the pitch and you can do whatever you like with it. But he then said, no, it's my right to pray on the pitch, in the middle of the field, just after the game, when the stadium was still full. And all. Anyway, the whole thing went to the Supreme Court, and in a spectacular judgment that literally nobody saw coming, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 in his favour. So this was sort of quite the thing for the idea that the United States has separation of church and state, because this is, on the face of it, looks like a pretty obvious breach of the Establishment Clause, but the Supreme Court took the view that actually, no, it was a private thing, and that nobody was being forced to join him. They sort of bought that particular argument. Another interesting case, number of cases, which is going on right now, I don't know if you've heard about these. In Texas, there is a law which was passed last year compelling schools to display the Ten Commandments in classrooms. Now, I think the law was that you weren't compelled, you didn't have to put them up unless somebody donated a poster or something of the Ten Commandments. And if somebody donated it, as the law says, you were required then to display it in classrooms. Now, this has gone through various court systems. At the minute, because there are over 1,000 court districts in Texas, and only some of them have gone to court, those which have gone to court have all won. And I think there's about 20 of them, maybe 25, something like this. But in the remaining 900-odd districts, they are now subject to this law, which will, of course, end up in the Supreme Court, and who knows how it will go. However, one thing that I find quite interesting about this is the level of malicious compliance that teachers in Texas are now going to display the Ten Commandments. Because there's nothing that says you can't add extra things onto the poster. So as you can see, the one on the left puts the Ten Commandments up and then highlights to all the children in the class why it's illegal and unconstitutional, drawing attention to the fact that the government of Texas are breaking the law. And then we have the ones on the right, which is even more, I think, sort of subversive. People are now drawing these, posters in rainbow colours and putting, LGBT, transgender chevrons on them. And because there's nothing in the law that says they have to look a particular way. So you can design them however you like. And there is a company, I think it's a charitable organisation actually, that's distributing these posters. So if you want to get these posters, they will send them to you. You're then required to put them up because these posters have been donated to you, and the school governors can do absolutely nothing about it because that's the law. So I find this quite interesting because a lot of times there are loopholes in these laws that people like to try to poke at and to get around. Another really good, interesting, I think, case, the group that does a lot of this stuff, is the Satanic Temple, which you may have heard of. The Satanic Temple, which actually has nothing really to do with Satanism. I think I'm never quite sure. I think it's a spoof religion. They certainly don't have anything remotely to do with, satanic rituals and doing all kinds of horrible things. In 2014, this was the start of the stuff I'm about to tell you. In 2014, they went to court claiming that there was a school board in Florida which was distributing Bibles to schools. And that's okay under the Establishment Clause. You are allowed to do that as long as any other religious organisation that comes along and says, we want you to distribute our literature, as long as you let them do it, right? Because then you're not discriminating against anyone. What would be illegal or unconstitutional would be to just let one group do it and prohibit others from doing it. You either have everybody allowed or nobody allowed, but you can't pick and choose, right? The Satanic Temple said, okay, this school board is having Bibles distributed to schools. we would like our satanic literature distributed to schools, because under the the Establishment Clause, this is their right. So what then? And I appreciate some of you, trigger warning at this point, right? You might just want to briefly look away, because I am now going to show you the kind of depraved and disgusting literature that the Satanic Temple wanted the young, impressionable minds of Florida to see. This is, it's quite shocking, right? As you can see, this is the sort of thing that nobody really in their right mind would want children to have in their possession. The Satanic Children's Big Book of Activities, quite disgusting. And, it gets worse once you start looking inside it. It includes things like, helping people to use inclusive language. Inclusive language, can you imagine? Inclusive language to diffuse tricky, complicated, social situations, right? And helping people come to terms with their emotions and dealing with social conflicts. Anyway, so they went to court about this. The school board lost, and the Satanic Temple were then allowed to distribute this literature, at which point the school board decided to change their mind, and then nobody was allowed to distribute any literature to their schools. The Satanic Temple are really interesting here because it doesn't end there. They still go on to the present day, taking up these cases all around the United States. This is an example of it, statues of the occult god Baphomet. They apply to have these statues erected in public spaces that have religious statues and symbols put up. Because again, if you can have, and obviously it's Christian symbols, right, in the United States, if you can have Christian statues put in a public space, you should be able to have satanic statues in a public space under the Establishment Clause. And so there are lots of cases where these statues get put up, and then also lots of cases of people coming down and sort of vandalising them and all these kinds of, trying to break them and stuff. They've also, by the way, interestingly, started to take issue with abortion laws in the United States, which is obviously now, going sort of full on trying to restrict women's reproductive rights. And the Satanic Temple have taken the view that abortion is an issue of religious freedom, because their argument is that the abortion ritual is an important part of being a Satanist, and by not being allowed to perform the abortion ritual, these laws, these restrictive laws, are impinging their religious rights. Now, they have gone to court in 3 different states about this. They've lost every single case so far. The argument being, they haven't lost it on a point of principle, on a point of order. They've lost it on a point of principle, which is that they're bringing a hypothetical case. And the judgments have all been that unless you have a plaintiff who has been materially harmed by these laws, you can't actually bring the case. Which puts them in a sort of invidious position, because unless they have a pregnant member of the Satanic Temple who wants to get an abortion and is then prevented from getting an abortion, they can't actually bring the case. And of course, by the time they do bring the case, it's a bit late because the person is already pregnant, presumably with an unwanted pregnancy. So legally, they're in a very sort of difficult position with this, and it's hard to see how they move forward with this particular argument, but nevertheless, they're still trying in various different avenues, so we'll wait and see what happens there. So that's the United States. The legal position in Europe is set out in Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights. It's a long thing here, which again, I'm not going to sort of go through. Just going to draw your attention to a couple of things. It's basically, everybody has religious freedom. Of course, the interesting phrase here again is religion or beliefs, right? So let me just flag that up. Should maybe put that in red as well, but I'll come back to that in just a second. And this can be limited only by certain criteria. So as you can see sort of towards the bottom, religious freedoms can be restricted for the protection of public order or public health. So obviously COVID, you could shut down religious places of worship, or morals, which is obviously a bit more subjective and sort of quite vague. But the main thing, again, I want to direct your attention to here is the Manifest Clause, which I'll come back to shortly. So this is how it looks in Europe, again, enshrined in the ECHR. In addition to this, many countries, not just in Europe, by the way, many countries also include extra safeguards against religious discrimination in the form of protected characteristics. So in the UK, under the 2010 Equality Act, it's illegal to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their age, their disability, their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, or their religion or belief. Now, this is interesting, and also, and I very much hope you're ahead of me on this, this is quite tricky. Because as we know, because we've encountered it at various points in the module, the starting point for the whole thing is that it's not at all clear what we mean by religion or belief. Right? How do we define religion? All of that stuff we talked about is directly relevant here. But now, of course, you might have thought at the time, well, maybe it's an interesting debate how we define religion, but doesn't have any practical consequences. Well, lo and behold, it does. And here they are. If you want to sort of go around saying people have, their religion or belief is protected, as it should be, got to find some way of nailing it down, right? It's not good enough to just kind of go, well, it kind of looks a bit like this, family resemblances, all that stuff, right? Can't turn up in front of a judge and go, if you squint a bit, looks like a religion, right? Got to have it nailed down in black and white. In the UK, the legal situation largely falls back on a case from 2005, which was brought by a group of Christian head teachers in a set of public schools who argued that the UK's ban on corporal punishment, i.e. hitting children, was an infringement of their religious freedom, right? You can't cane kids anymore. Obviously, that's leading to all the sort of wokery and all the rest of it. Society's collapsing. But more importantly, it was an infringement on their religious freedom, which they argued would allow them to discipline children by inflicting physical harm. The court then decided, actually, no, this is wrong. You don't have the religious freedom to hit people. But then, of course, they had to define what religion was. Now, it's a fairly lengthy section, right? So there's more to it than this, but here are some of the key ones. The court argued that religion has to be consistent with basic standards of human dignity and integrity. So again, you can't hit people. It must relate to matters more than merely trivial and must possess an adequate degree of seriousness. Again, I sort of think that's a little bit vague because we saw, in the lecture on how we define religion, there was the whole thing about Jediism not being classified as a religion. But I mean, who gets to define if that's serious or not? If somebody takes Jediism really seriously, then does it not warrant the category of seriousness? Again, this to me feels like it's a little bit of pushing the question back. You haven't really solved the problem, you've now just moved it into another subjective domain. And finally here, a religion must be coherent in the sense of being intelligible and capable of being understood, which is also interesting given all of that stuff we've talked about at previous points in the module about John Rawls, comprehensive doctrines, and all of that stuff. Because Rawls would say, well, they're not intelligible unless you're on the inside. So again, does that solve the problem? And so, interestingly, this kind of has solved some legal issues, but it then opens up the way for a whole bunch of further court cases, people now coming to court arguing that this particular belief should be protected. So I'm going to give you a set of cases now, all of which are actually are true, have been to court, and I'm not going to ask you to kind of vote on it or anything, right? But in fact, I might do, but not obviously, don't shout out, just put your hands up. So here are a series of cases. Typically, these tend to be kind of employment rights cases, right? People getting sacked because they've said or done particular things, and then they go and they make this argument that it's their religion or belief, and then the court has to decide. Okay, anti-fox hunting views. Raise your hands if you think this is classified as a protected characteristic on the grounds of religion or belief. For the record, for those of you listening at home, 0 people have raised their hands at this point, maybe one person, which means that everybody in the room is completely wrong because anti-fox hunting views are a protected characteristic under the 2010 Equality Act. Okay, item number 2, supporting Brexit. Lots of things I could say about supporting Brexit, but do you think it's a protected belief? Raise your hands if you think it is. Again, 2 people, for those of you who couldn't be bothered to turn up. And in this case, you were right. It is not, in fact, a protected belief. Okay, thirdly, men and women were created by God, and transgender pronouns should be refused. Is this a protected belief? Raise your hands if you think it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe half a dozen or so. Okay, in this case, it's not a protected belief. I'm not going to do this all day, but I do have like maybe 3 more, I think. The belief that gender is binary, which is kind of like the last one, but like not quite as extensive. Is this protected? If you argue that gender is binary, can you be summarily dismissed from your employment? Maybe, 10 people or so. It is a protected belief under UK law. Public service broadcasting, I like this one. Public service broadcasting has a higher purpose of promoting social cohesion. I think this was a case of somebody who didn't want to pay their TV licence. And this was the argument they concocted. Is this a protected belief? Raise your hands if you think it is. Not many people here. This is, in fact, a protected belief. Okay, last 2. Ethical veganism, yes or no? Raise your hands if you think it is. About half, maybe. Yes, in fact, this is protected. And then finally, vegetarianism. Any fans of vegetarianism? Nobody thinks this is protected? Okay, unfortunately, as a vegetarian, this is not a protected belief in the UK. Okay, so the critical issue, which I've kind of been skirting around so far, within all of this, is that the distinction here, or there is a distinction here between, in law, between the belief, your right to hold a belief, and the manifestation of that belief. Freedom of belief, the right to express a belief and to practice that belief, is an absolute right under the European Convention, right? Can't be touched. The right to manifest your beliefs is a qualified right. So there's a distinction between the absolute right and the qualified right. Holding a belief is an absolute right. Manifesting a belief is a qualified right, which means it can be limited or qualified by the interests of other people who might be affected. Now, it's not always clear what counts as a valid manifestation of religion, and the view of the European Court of Human Rights, a lot of these cases end up, gives member states quite a degree of freedom to determine this for themselves. A good example of this is the case of Ibrahimian versus France from 2015. This was a case where a hospital worker who was wearing, we're not quite clear what she was wearing, the court documents say veil, so we don't know if it was a burqa or a hijab or a niqab or, it just says veil. The hospital worker, who was a Muslim, did not have her contract renewed on the grounds that she wanted to wear the veil, and the hospital said, no, you can't wear this because French laws around ostentatious symbols in public life. She then took this case to court and lost. So the court's decision was that the French state was entitled to rule that it could uphold the principles of secularism in this particular way. More recently, 2024, there's been a case where Belgium, the state of Belgium, was taken to court over, again, similar thing, right? Bans on wearing religious clothing in public life. And the court again decided it was up for the Belgian government to determine this. So they have quite a degree of freedom to determine these things for themselves. Now, one view on the manifestation issue, because again, the question then is, well, what counts as a manifestation of a particular belief? And one thing that kind of comes into this is whether an action or a behaviour is required or inspired by a particular faith. So, for instance, Sikhs in Britain are legally entitled to wear a Kara bangle at school because the Kara bangle is a legitimate manifestation of their beliefs. It's a requirement of the faith that they wear it. It's also a requirement of the faith that Sikhs carry kirpans, which are small knives, which is more controversial, and in some countries, Denmark and Italy, for example, it's illegal. But in the UK, it's not, because it's seen as, it's accepted that this is a requirement of the Sikh faith. So again, if it's required, The view is that you can manifest this faith without any legal consequences. Other issues, though, again, it becomes a bit more disputed. There's debates around, for example, whether or not school children should be permitted or compelled to wear the hijab in schools. And there have been cases that have gone to court to try to, determine this. This was one from 2006. Shabina Begum was her name, and the school in question said that you're not allowed to wear the hijab as part of your school uniform. She took the case to court, arguing that she should be allowed to wear this because it was a requirement of her faith. The judgment was that the school were right, or the school had the right to say that no, she couldn't wear a hijab, and it was not, in fact, a requirement of the Islamic faith that she do this. So the required versus inspired issue is one which kind of runs through the whole issue of whether or not manifesting your belief has legal support. And then just two more cases to bring to your attention. This is quite old now, but this is from 2013. This is a case, but it's old, but it's the landmark case. And I'm sure you might have heard of it, right? It went to the European Court of Human Rights. Nadia Awada, Shirley Chaplin, Lillian Liddell, there were four plaintiffs, and Gary McFarlane, all went to court alleging religious discrimination on employment grounds. I'm only discussing two of them here because these were sort of the main ones that got picked up on. The only case that was successful was the woman on the left, Nadia Awada. Nadia Awada was a British Airways hostess who argued that she'd been sent home from work for wearing a crucifix. And she argued that this was discrimination against her ability to, her right to manifest her faith. British Airways then said, you should wear the cross under your uniform. And she said, no, I should wear it over my uniform. And it went to court and she won. So the decision was that British Airways were wrong to say that she could not wear her crucifix, right? In this case, the victory was slightly Pyrrhic because British Airways had, in the meantime, changed their policies to allow people to do this anyway. So the law wasn't actually, affected by the outcome. The second case, which was sort of similar, from Shirley Chaplin, who was a nurse and also wanted to wear a crucifix at work. And the argument of the hospital was that this was a health and safety issue, because if she's leaning over a patient, the patient could be in whatever sort of condition, right? Maybe they're on drugs or, have certain emotional problems or regulation and so forth. They could grab the necklace and that causes, a potential problem. And the court ruled that the hospital were within their rights to say that she could not wear this at work. So this is the sort of big case that's still on the books for employment law. The final thing I'm going to just quickly finish with today is the gay cake affair that I mentioned right at the very beginning. This was a bakery, as I said, in Northern Ireland. There was a case very similar in the United States as well that refused to make a cake with as you can see here, this is the Burton Ernie, and the message was that the person receiving the cake should support gay marriage. And the bakers refused to bake this cake. Initially, they'd accepted this is where it got a little bit complicated, maybe. The bakers initially accepted the order and then realised, actually, we don't want to do that, and then they changed their mind. And then the customer, who was themselves gay, then argued that they were discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation. The bakers said, no, it's an infringement on our religious freedom. You can't force us to make this cake. And so it went all the way through the court system. We could talk more about this in seminars next week because it is a really interesting case. But the decision that was eventually made was in favour of the bakers. And the reasoning for this was that in refusing to bake this cake, you could dispute the legal argumentation. I'm just telling you what the case was. In refusing to bake this cake, the bakers were not discriminating against a person. They were rejecting a message. And rejecting a message is not the same as rejecting a person. And this could not be connected to this person's sexual orientation because getting married was not a requirement of being gay. The bakers could simply say, we don't support same-sex marriage, that's not necessarily the same as saying we don't like gay people. Lots of gay people themselves might reject the institute of marriage, right? They might see it as being a heteronormative, capitalist, imperialist thing, and they don't want everything to do with it. It's entirely possible to be extremely gay and extremely anti-marriage. So rejecting a message that says support marriage in some form or another does not necessarily equate to rejecting sexual orientation, was the argument of the court. But we'll see what you think next week. And that then, perfectly on time for once, is it from me for today. Thanks, as usual, for turning up, and I will see you next time round.